right, so listen to you guys sent in some info about this Massachusetts case, and well, it's a doozy.
Yeah, this one's really something.
Yeah, we're talking judicial immunity and possible jury tampering, all that good stuff.
Oh, yeah, the whole 9 yards.
So buckle up, everybody, because we're diving deep into the Karen Reed trial in Norfolk County.
This is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, so to set the stage a little bit, we've got Judge Beverly Canone presiding over this trial.
Right, and that's actually where a lot of the controversy starts.
Okay, so what's going on with the judge?
Well, her administrative term as judge actually ended during the trial.
Wait, what? So her term just, like, expired?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
But she kept on presiding over the case even after that.
Okay, I'm already seeing some red flags here.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the whole judicial immunity thing.
Right, because that's a major issue that this case brings up.
So for those of us who, haven't been to law school, what exactly does judicial immunity mean?
Basically, it means judges are protected from being sued for decisions they make in court.
Oh, okay. So they can't be held personally liable.
Exactly. It's kind of like a shield that lets them do their jobs without fear of being sued every time someone's unhappy with the outcome.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want judges constantly worried about getting sued.
Right. Otherwise, they couldn't do their jobs effectively.
But where's the line? Like, could a judge just go totally rogue and still be protected?
Well, no, not exactly. There are definitely limits to judicial immunity.
Okay, so what are those limits?
Like, think about the case Stump v. Sparkman. That established that judges are protected when they're acting within their official role as a judge.
Okay, but what if they step outside that role?
That's when things get tricky. And that's what's being debated in this case.
So are there any specific examples of what a judge might do that would fall outside of judicial immunity?
Yeah, actually, there are some important cases that have clarified those exceptions over the years.
Oh, okay, like what?
Like, for example, Pulliam v. Allen, that showed judges can be held accountable for actions they take outside their judicial duties.
So if they're not acting as a judge, they're not protected.
Right. And then there's Dennis v. Sparks, which showed that if a judge conspires with someone to violate someone's rights, they lose that immunity.
Whoa, okay. So if they're working with someone to intentionally harm someone else.
Exactly. Then judicial immunity doesn't apply.
That's interesting. So how do those examples relate to the Karen Reed case?
Well, the video you sent pointed out a couple of hypothetical scenarios that could be relevant here.
Oh, like what?
For instance, what if a judge throws out a partial jury acquittal or works with the prosecution to influence the case?
Okay, yeah, those sound pretty bad.
Right. Those are the kinds of actions that could put judicial immunity in jeopardy.
So in this case, with Judge Canone staying on even after her term ended, things could get really complicated if there's any hint of wrongdoing.
Oh, absolutely. And on top of that, you've got the defense attorney raising concerns about 3 jurors who were dismissed from the case.
Well, hold on. So some of the jurors were just removed.
Yep. And get this, the defense attorney thinks they were leaning towards acquittal.
Oh, wow. So potentially pro-defense jurors were just booted from the jury.
That's the claim. And the timing is definitely suspicious.
So why were they dismissed?
Well, that's part of the problem. It's not entirely clear.
So it could have been anything.
Yeah. Juror dismissals do happen sometimes, but usually there's a clear reason like bias or the juror being unable to continue serving.
Right, like a family emergency or something.
Exactly. But in this case, the circumstances surrounding their dismissal are really murky.
Okay. And what does the defense attorney have to say about all this?
Well, he even pointed out that the jurors' body language seemed like they were on the defendant's side before they were suddenly dismissed.
So he thinks something shady might be going on.
It's hard to prove jury tampering without hard evidence.
Yeah, I bet.
But his observations definitely raised some red flags.
It does seem like a pretty big coincidence that these specific jurors were dismissed right after deliberations began.
Right. That's what makes it so suspicious.
So what are we supposed to make of this whole juror situation?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something that warrants a closer look.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so we've got the judge's term ending the jurors being dismissed. And now here's the kicker.
Oh, yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
Apparently there was a state trooper involved in this whole thing.
And not just any state trooper, he was assigned to oversee the jury.
Hold on. What, a state trooper was overseeing the jury? How is that even allowed?
That's the thing. It's not, at least not in Massachusetts.
So this is a major break from standard procedure.
Absolutely. Normally, you'd have court officers or clerks handling all the jury stuff.
What makes sense?
Not a state trooper who was actually involved in the investigation of this very case.
Wait a minute. So the trooper who investigated the case was put in charge of the jury?
Yep. You got it.
Okay. Yeah, that's setting off some major alarm bells for me.
Yep.
That seems incredibly problematic.
It is. It raises huge concerns about bias and potential influence over the jury.
I mean, come on, the trooper could have a personal interest in the outcome of the case.
Exactly. And that's not how our justice system is supposed to work. We're talking about potential legal and ethical violations here.
So didn't the video mention some court cases that relate to this whole trooper situation?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some big ones, actually.
Okay, like what?
Well, there's Turner v. Louisiana, which made it very clear that any undue influence by law enforcement on a jury is absolutely prohibited.
So having this trooper potentially interacting with the jurors and maybe even influencing their decisions, that's a no-go.
Exactly. And then there's Holbrook v. Flynn, which emphasized that jury deliberations have to happen in a completely neutral environment.
So no intimidation or pressure from anyone, especially law enforcement.
Right. The jury needs to be free from any outside influence.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
So how does that apply to this state trooper being in charge of the jury?
It's a textbook example of a conflict of interest. There's no legal basis for it, and it goes against everything the Massachusetts jury instructions stand for.
And those instructions are there to protect the integrity of the jury process, right?
Exactly, to ensure it's fair and impartial.
Okay, so to recap, we've got a judge whose term is over jurors being dismissed under questionable circumstances and a state trooper overseeing the jury. This is a lot.
It is. It's a wild case for sure.
And it sounds like the defense could have a field day with all of this.
Oh, they just might. Especially if they can show a pattern of potential misconduct.
So how could the defense actually use all of this in court? Would they argue for federal intervention based on what we've discussed?
That's a great question, and the answer is they could. And the video actually mentions some key cases that could support that argument.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, there's Brady v. Maryland, for starters.
Okay, and what does that one say?
That one established that prosecutors have to turn over any evidence that could help the defense.
So no hiding evidence that can help the defendant.
Right, exactly. It's all about making sure the defense has everything they need to build a strong case.
Makes sense. And the video also mentioned Lieberg v. Health Services Acquisition Corp., right?
Yep, that one's interesting. It showed that a judge hiding info that could change the trial's outcome is a big no-no.
Yeah, that sounds pretty serious.
It is. It could even be grounds for a new trial.
So connecting that back to this case, if the trooper, for example, gave the judge information that led to those juror dismissals and the defense wasn't told about it,
That's a major problem.
yeah, that could be a huge violation of their right to a fair trial.
Absolutely. A classic due process violation.
So then that's where a federal habeas corpus petition could come into play.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give us a quick legal lesson?
Yeah.
What exactly is a habeas corpus petition?
Sure. So basically, it's a way for someone to challenge their detention by arguing they're being held illegally.
Okay.
In this case, the defense could use it to argue that the whole state trial was so messed up that it violated Karen Reed's constitutional rights.
Gotcha. So they're basically going over the state court's head and asking the federal court to step in.
Yep, exactly. And the video actually lays out some specific points they could argue.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Well, first off, there's Judge Canone appointing that trooper who's connected to the investigation. That right there is a potential conflict of interest.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right.
Not at all. And there's a case, Caperton VAT Massey Colco, where a judge didn't recuse himself because of a conflict of interest, and it was a huge due process violation.
So that could be a strong argument for the defense.
Definitely. And then there's the whole possibility of jury tampering.
Right back to those dismissed jurors.
Exactly. And this is where a case like Remmer v. United States comes in.
Okay, what happened in that case?
Well, it basically established that any private contact with a juror during a trial is potentially prejudicial.
So even just talking to a juror outside of the courtroom setting,
Right. It could be seen as an attempt to influence them.
that's a big no-no.
Huge. And then finally, the defense could argue that the trooper's very presence, possibly influencing the jury, denied Karen Reed her right to a fair trial.
And is there a case that supports that argument?
You bet, Shepard v. Maxwell. That one showed how media coverage and publicity can impact a jury's impartiality.
So they're basically saying the trooper's presence created a similar kind of biased environment.
Right. Exactly.
Wow. So the defense has a lot of potential legal ammo here.
They do.
Hmm.
But what about Judge Canone's side of the story? What could her defense be?
Yeah, good point. What could she possibly say to justify all of this?
Well, one argument she could make is that she brought in the trooper because of the protests happening outside the courthouse.
Oh, so she was concerned about security,
Right.
trying to keep the jury safe.
I mean, that sounds reasonable on the surface. But couldn't those protests have been handled by regular security personnel?
That's the thing. The video points out that Judge Canone had already taken steps to ensure safety.
Like what?
She had set up a buffer zone around the courthouse and had local police there to maintain order.
So if they were already on top of security, why bring in a state trooper specifically to watch over the jury?
Exactly. It seems a little excessive.
Yeah, and especially since handling the jury is usually a court function, not a law enforcement one. Right. And the video reminds us that court officers are typically the ones responsible for jury management, not state troopers.
So this whole trooper thing really is out of the ordinary.
Big time. It's a major departure from standard procedure.
Okay, so the protest excuse doesn't seem very strong. What about other options for keeping the jury safe?
Well, the video brought up the possibility of jury sequestration.
Oh, right, isolating them from any outside influence.
Exactly. That's what they did in United States v. Gotti to protect the integrity of the trial.
So if Judge Canone was truly worried about those protests, she could have chosen to sequester the jury.
Exactly. But she didn't. She went with the state trooper option instead.
And that decision is what's raising all these red flags.
For sure. The video even suggests that maybe she wanted more control over the jury, potentially tilting things in the prosecution's favor.
Whoa, that's a serious accusation.
It is, and it would be hard to prove.
Yeah, I bet. So what could the defense focus on to try and build their case?
Well, they could really hammer home that potential jury tampering.
Right, because the fact that she removed those 3 jurors, possibly based on info from the trooper, that's a big deal.
Huge. And it goes back to that whole idea of undue influence that we talked about earlier.
Remmer v. United States made it very clear that any private contact with a juror during a trial should be viewed with suspicion.
Exactly. And the defense could argue that the trooper's very presence and potential interactions with the jury created an environment ripe for improper influence.
And if they can show that the trooper actually played a role in getting those jurors dismissed,
That could be seen as straight-up jury tampering.
which is a big no-no.
A massive one. In fact, the video even cites U.S. Code Title 18, Section 1503, which makes it clear that jury tampering to obstruct justice is a federal offense.
Okay, so this whole state trooper situation is incredibly messed up.
It is. And it really seems like the defense has a strong case here.
They do,
Yeah.
especially with Judge Canone refusing to poll the jury after those dismissals.
Right. That combined with the trooper's involvement creates a pretty compelling argument for due process violations.
And all of that could lead to a federal intervention and a whole new trial.
Potentially. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, this whole case is a wild ride. So what does this all mean for our listener? What's the big takeaway from all this talk about judicial immunity, jury tampering, and due process?
I think the Karen Reed case really highlights how important fairness and impartiality are in our courts.
Right. Like those are the cornerstones of our justice system.
Exactly. And any crack in those foundations, whether it's intentional or not, can have huge consequences.
It's a reminder that we can't take justice for granted. We have to stay informed and hold the system accountable.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This case, no matter how it ends, shows why it's so important for citizens to understand these legal concepts.
Yeah, because the more we know, the better we can advocate for a more just system.
Exactly.
So to our listeners out there, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better system.
It matters.
You have a voice, and your understanding of these issues can make a real difference.
It really makes you think, huh? Like, if you were in Karen Reed's shoes, what would you do next?
Right. What would your next move be?
If I were her lawyer, I'd be laser focused on showing how all these irregularities add up.
Right. It's not just one thing. It's like a whole pattern of questionable behavior.
Exactly. Like, it's the judge's term ending and then the juror dismissals, A&D, the state trooper being involved.
Come on. How many red flags do we need?
Right, each piece just makes the argument that Karen Reed didn't get a fair trial even stronger.
And that's where they'd try to get the federal court involved with that habeas corpus petition, right?
Exactly. They'd be saying, look, the state trial was so messed up that it violated her constitutional rights. We need a do-over.
And the federal
And-
court would be looking for evidence to support that claim, right?
Right. They want to see if the judge made serious errors, if there was bias, if anything happened that shouldn't have.
And from what we've talked about today, it seems like the defense has a pretty decent argument.
They might, but, the legal system is complicated.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The defense has the burden of proof. They have to convince the federal court that the problems in the state trial were big enough to warrant their intervention.
So even with all this stuff, it's not a slam dunk that they'll get a new trial.
Unfortunately not. Federal courts usually respect state court decisions unless there's really clear evidence of a major problem.
Man, that's tough. So this whole thing could drag on for a while, couldn't it?
It definitely could. If the federal court decides to take the case, there will be all sorts of legal procedure.
Right, briefs, hearings, maybe even witness testimony.
Exactly. Could be a long road ahead.
All right, you guys wanted it, so buckle up, because we're doing a deep dive into the Karen Read case, specifically Judge Beverly Canny. That's Cannony, not Cannon. And, well, how the feds played a role in her first trial.
Yeah, there are definitely some twists and turns here. It definitely raises some questions about how the case was handled.
So to really get this, we need to start with Judge Cannon. Like, what's her background, and why does all that even matter in this case?
Well, up until very recently, Judge Cannon held a pretty powerful position. She was the regional administrative justice for Norfolk County. So think of it like the head of the department, but, for judges. So she was responsible for, overseeing the other judges, managing the court's calendar, basically making sure things were running smoothly in the court.
Okay, so someone in a position like that, they should have a pretty solid grasp of, legal procedures and all that, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. You're expected to be an expert in court procedures, rules of evidence, everything that goes into making sure a trial is fair. And typically, superior court justices like Judge Cannon, they rotate out of these administrative roles every 3 years. So she would have had ample time to, build up that expertise.
Which makes it even more curious that she's still presiding over Reed's case,
Yeah.
even though she's not in that administrative role anymore.
Exactly. It seems like she's continuing in a special capacity for this case, which brings up a pretty fascinating question. Does she still have the same judicial immunity as other judges?
Okay, so let's talk about this whole judicial immunity thing. It kind of sounds like judges have this sweet deal, They can make decisions, and even if those decisions are wrong, they're safe from being sued.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. So, judicial immunity protects judges from being personally liable for decisions they make, as long as it's in their official capacity as a judge. And it's really meant to ensure they can act independently and impartially without being afraid of, reprisal for their decisions.
That makes sense. But like you said, there are limits to this immunity, right?
Oh, absolutely, there are. And that's where things get really interesting.
So let's dive into those limits. Like, what are some of the scenarios where a judge might not be protected by this judicial immunity?
Well, one of the key limits is acting outside of one's jurisdiction, basically like overstepping their bounds. So one question is, did Judge Cannon overstep her bounds in this case? Another limit is violating due process, which basically means deliberately ignoring someone's constitutional rights. So, for example, and this is an allegation, if Judge Cannon suppressed a jury's partial acquittal, that could be a major problem.
Okay, so even judges can't just disregard the Constitution and get away with it.
Exactly. And finally, there's the issue of non-judicial acts. And this refers to actions that fall outside of a judge's official duties, like if they were to improperly collaborate with the prosecution. There are some serious questions about whether Judge Cannon might have crossed that line.
So this is where it starts to feel like those seemingly small details could add up to a pretty big problem, if her actions are seen as going too far.
Yeah, I mean, if a judge's actions are ultimately found to be outside the scope of judicial immunity, they could potentially face some serious consequences.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and focus on the pretrial phase of Reed's first trial. We're calling it Trial 1.0. This was back in January 2024. And there were some pretty explosive allegations at that time, something about a federal investigation, right?
Yeah, that's right. Reed's defense attorneys, they were pushing for sanctions against the district attorney, Michael Morrissey, and they actually wanted him disqualified from the case entirely.
Whoa. What would lead them to take such a drastic step like that?
Well, they claimed that DA Morrissey was actually under investigation by the feds himself, and that he knew about this investigation before the defense did, but he deliberately concealed that fact.
Wait a minute, so the DA might have been under investigation himself while prosecuting this case? I mean, that just seems like a huge conflict of interest.
Yeah, and that was precisely the defense's argument. They were basically saying that, because of this potential federal investigation, DA Morrissey had a personal stake in the outcome of Reed's case.
Yeah.
Which would completely compromise his ability to, be impartial.
So what was Judge Cannon's response to all of this?
Well, that's the interesting part. Judge Cannon was aware of all of this. The potential federal investigation, the DA's alleged attempts to conceal it, everything. But despite all of that, she still ruled against the defense.
So what are we supposed to make of that? Was she just, siding with the DA?
Yeah.
Or was there more to it?
Well, it definitely raises the question, did Judge Cannon rule against the defense to protect the DA, knowing he was potentially under federal investigation? And if so, what does that mean for Karen Read and her right to a fair trial?
That's a pretty unsettling thought. And it seems like this theme of potential bias just continues into the trial itself,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to the FBI's involvement.
Oh, it does. And that's really where we start to see how the defense's strategy of bringing in the feds might have backfired in some really unexpected ways.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now. Let's get into that. What exactly happened with the feds during Trial 1.0?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. The defense called 3 expert witnesses to the stand. And, get this, they were all hired by the FBI to reconstruct the accident.
Hold on, the defense called FBI witnesses. That seems kind of counterintuitive. Why would they do that?
Well, because what these experts found completely contradicted the prosecution's case. They concluded that Karen Reed's vehicle did not hit John O'Keefe, and that his injuries weren't consistent with being hit by a car at all.
So the FBI's own experts are basically saying the prosecution's whole theory was wrong. Talk about a plot twist.
Yeah, it was a major bombshell. And Judge Cannon's reaction to all of this was, let's just say it raised some eyebrows.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about Judge Cannon's behavior during this part of the trial.
Well, instead of focusing on the experts' qualifications and, their conclusions, she seemed fixated on these, seemingly irrelevant details. For instance, she kept questioning who selected the information that was provided to the experts, as if that somehow invalidated their findings.
I don't know. What do you make of that line of questioning? How common is it for a judge to focus on those kinds of details?
It's definitely unusual, especially given that these were experts hired by the FBI. I mean, you'd expect there to be a certain level of trust in their methods and their findings.
It almost feels like she was trying to discredit the FBI's investigation without directly saying so.
Yeah, it's a valid observation. It definitely raises the question of whether she was genuinely concerned about the integrity of the investigation or whether she was looking for any excuse to discredit the FBI's experts.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't something similar happen with another expert witness?
Yes, it did. Let's talk about Dr. Richard Frenchler. He's a biomechanical engineer with a lot of experience testifying in court. And like Dr. Wolf, he was also hired by the FBI. And his conclusions were, very damaging to the prosecution's theory.
Okay, before we get into Judge Cannon's reaction, I want to understand what Dr. Frenchler actually concluded. What did his analysis show?
He determined that the injuries John O'Keefe sustained were not consistent with being hit by a car. So in other words, he was saying that the physical evidence just didn't match up with the prosecution's claim that Karen Reed ran over O'Keefe with her vehicle.
Wow, that's a pretty significant conclusion. So how did Judge Cannon handle his testimony?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Instead of focusing on the scientific basis for Dr. Frenchler's conclusions, she allowed the prosecution to spend a significant amount of time questioning him.
Experts are often called upon by both sides in legal cases.
Right, you're right. There's nothing inherently suspicious about an expert testifying for both the prosecution and the defense. At different times, it just means they're providing their expertise based on the specific evidence presented in each case.
So it feels like the prosecution was trying to play dirty, and Judge Cannon just allowed it.
That's a reasonable conclusion. It definitely raises questions about whether she was truly committed to ensuring a fair and impartial trial, or whether she was more interested in helping the prosecution, secure a conviction.
And wasn't there also something about emails, like between the defense and one of the experts, something about payment being discussed?
Oh, yeah, that was a pretty dramatic moment in the trial. The prosecution made a big show of revealing these emails, trying to paint the defense as somehow influencing Dr. Wolf's conclusions.
They were implying that the defense had paid him off
Yeah,
to give them the results they wanted.
exactly. But what the emails actually showed was that the defense had initially tried to hire Dr. Wolf independently, but he had informed them that he couldn't proceed until he got clarification from the U.S. Attorney's Office about how his involvement would move forward.
So the defense was actually following proper procedures, and the prosecution was just twisting the facts to make them look bad.
Precisely. It was a classic case of trying to create a scandal where there wasn't one.
And Judge Cannon didn't intervene to clarify the situation at all.
She allowed the prosecution to present their narrative without highlighting that the emails actually showed the defense acting ethically.
It's starting to feel like a pattern here. Judge Cannon seems to consistently give the prosecution the benefit of the doubt, even when their actions are, questionable, while simultaneously scrutinizing every move the defense makes.
It's a valid observation. And it's this pattern of behavior that has led many legal experts to question Judge Cannon's impartiality in this case.
But surely the defense had some recourse, right? Couldn't they object to these tactics or challenge the judge's rulings?
Oh, they objected repeatedly, but their objections were almost always overruled by Judge Cannon. It often felt like she had already made up her mind and was determined to see the prosecution's case succeed, regardless of the evidence presented.
That's a pretty concerning thought. It seems like a judge wielding that much power could easily sway a jury, even if the evidence is pointing in a different direction.
Yeah, that's the inherent danger of judicial bias. It can undermine the entire principle of a fair trial, where both sides are supposed to be given an equal opportunity to present their case.
Now, I know we're still focusing on Trial 1.0, but I can't help but wonder how all of this plays into the upcoming retrial, Trial 2.0.
That's the crucial question. And to fully understand the potential implications, we need to rewind to the end of Trial 1.0 and talk about the rather unexpected outcome. Remember, it ended in a mistrial, but not for the reasons you might think.
Okay, I'm all ears. Fill me in. Why did the first trial end in a mistrial?
Well, the jury actually came back with a partial acquittal. They found Karen Rad not guilty on the most serious charge, manslaughter.
Hold on. They acquitted her on the most serious charge, but it still ended in a mistrial. How is that even possible?
Well, that's what makes this case so unique and, frankly, quite baffling.
This is mind-blowing. So what are the potential legal ramifications of all of this? Can a judge even be held accountable for this kind of behavior?
It's rare, but it has happened. There's a precedent in a case called Capan VAT Massey Colco, where a judge's actions were deemed so egregious that judicial immunity didn't protect them.
So if Judge Cannon's actions are found to have crossed the line, she could actually face real consequences.
It's definitely a possibility. The defense is pushing for a federal investigation into her conduct, and they're also pursuing a habeas corpus petition, which is a way to challenge the legality of someone's detention. They're essentially arguing that Reed's continued imprisonment is unlawful because she was denied a fair trial.
Wow. So this isn't just about getting a new trial. This is about potentially exposing a system that might be deeply flawed.
Exactly. This case has become much bigger than just the specific charges against Karen Reed. It's raising fundamental questions about judicial impartiality, the power of the prosecution, really the very foundation of our justice system.
It's a lot to unpack. And we've only just scratched the surface. But before we get into the potential outcomes of all this, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far. We've seen how Judge Cannon's handling of the expert witnesses, her rulings on key motions, and her actions, or lack thereof during jury deliberations, have raised some serious concerns about whether Karen Reed received a fair trial.
It's a complex case with a lot of nuances, but hopefully we've been able to shed some light on the key issues at play and why so many people are questioning the integrity of the process.
So the big question is, where does this case go from here? What are the possible outcomes? And what does it all mean for Karen Reed and the future of Trial 2.0? We'll explore those questions and more in the final part of this deep dive. So we've spent the last two parts digging into some, well, let's be honest, some pretty disturbing stuff about Judge Cannon's actions in Karen Reed's first trial. And now the question everyone's asking is what's next?
Well, as we mentioned, Reed is waiting for a retrial, Trial 2.0, like we've been calling it. But the defense is actually pushing to have the case dismissed completely.
Seriously. Dismissed, like gone.
Yep. They're basically saying that the first trial was so messed up, so biased, that there's just no way to guarantee Karen Reed a fair trial, even with a do-over.
Okay, so that's a bold move. What are the odds of them actually pulling that off?
It's hard to say for sure. It's a tough thing to get a case dismissed like that, but it's not impossible. The defense is arguing that Judge Cannon didn't just, make a few mistakes. They're saying her actions were a pattern of behavior meant to make sure Red got convicted, no matter what the evidence showed.
Well, we've definitely seen enough examples of that in this deep dive. How she dealt with those expert witnesses, refusing to poll the jury, and just her whole attitude toward the defense's concerns. It's not a good look.
And don't forget about those allegations against the DA himself. The fact that he might have been under federal investigation while prosecuting this case, that just adds another layer of doubt about whether this whole thing was handled fairly.
So let's say the case does go to a retrial. What should we be watching for?
Well, the first thing is, will Judge Cannon still be the judge? The defense wants her off the case. They're saying she's just too biased to give Reed a fair trial.
And if she's recused, does that mean the case is automatically dismissed?
Not necessarily. It probably means a new judge would be assigned, and they'd have to review everything that's happened so far, make their own decisions on any motions that are still pending.
That's like a total mess.
It could be, yeah. But it might be the only way to get this case back on track and make sure it's fair.
You know what I'm curious about? What's the prosecution going to do about their own experts, the FBI experts, contradicting their whole theory of the case?
Hmm.
Are they going to try to, like, trash those experts now?
That's the million-dollar question. Will they stick to their original story, even though the FBI's findings kind of blew it up? Or will they try to come up with a whole new theory?
Either way, it's going to be tough to convince a jury.
For sure, that's a big obstacle for the prosecution. If they want to get a conviction in Trial 2.0, they're going to have to find a really good way to explain away what the FBI found.
This whole case is just fascinating, in a really messed up kind of way. It shows how things can go so wrong, even in a system that's supposed to be all about justice. When people in power abuse their power or let their biases get in the way.
It definitely shows us that we can't just assume the system will always work like it should. We have to pay attention, ask questions, and hold people accountable, especially those who are supposed to uphold the law.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? The people who wanted to know all about Judge Cannon and the feds in the Karen Reed case.
I think the big thing is that this case is about way more than just whether one woman is guilty or innocent. It's about the whole idea of a fair trial, whether judges are impartial, and what that means for all of us.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me, and I hope it has been for our listeners too. We uncovered some pretty disturbing stuff, but it's important to remember this is just one case. It doesn't necessarily mean the whole system is broken, but it definitely shows where things can go wrong and why we all need to stay involved and make sure justice is actually being served.
Absolutely. And as the Karen Reed case keeps moving forward, we'll be keeping an eye on it to see what happens and what it means for the future of the justice system in Massachusetts.
This case, no matter how it turns out, is a perfect example of why it's so important to understand these legal concepts.
It's true, because the more we know about things like judicial immunity and due process, the better equipped we are to spot these problems.
And speak out against them.
Yeah, exactly. We all have a role to play in making sure justice is served.
So to our listeners, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better system.
Your voice matters.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.